The Vashar Dominion had ruled the galaxy for over 100 millennia, a civilization so ancient that even the oldest star maps labeled their borders as the Eternal Empire. Their fleets spanned thousands of worlds, their technology capable of reshaping planets and their laws enforced with merciless efficiency. To them, lesser species were tolerated only so long as they remained unremarkable. The Vashar had seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations. None had ever threatened their supremacy. None until humanity. It was a simple truth the Vashar could not ignore. Humans adapted too quickly, thought too differently. Unlike the others who accepted the Dominion's rule or faded into obscurity, humanity fought. They fought with desperation, with ingenuity, with a ferocity that defied all predictions. They were not the strongest, nor the most advanced, but they were unpredictable, resourceful, and above all, relentless. The Vashar had studied them, watched their rapid growth, their victories against forces they had no right to defeat. And then the Council made its decision. Humanity was an anomaly, a danger that must be eliminated before they became something far worse. It began with border skirmishes, disguised as containment operations. Then came the purges, entire colonies reduced to cinders in moments. Whole fleets erased from existence before their commanders could even grasp what was happening. The Vashar did not wage war as humans did. They ended wars before they could begin. The massacre of the Arcadian Line was the final blow. Billions of human lives, wiped from existence in a single orbital bombardment. The Dominion's grand proclamation was clear. Humanity would not be allowed to continue. They had been judged. And they had been sentenced. But the Vashar had made a mistake. They had underestimated one man's capacity for revenge. In the frozen silence of deep space, within the wreckage of a long-forgotten war, a lone warship drifted. It was no longer a human vessel, nor was it wholly alien. Modified beyond recognition, it was a hybrid of scavenged technology and desperate ingenuity, a testament to the one who piloted it. Commander Elias Caney had once been a decorated officer, a leader of men. Now, he was something else. Something far more dangerous. The last survivor of Arcadia, the architect of vengeance. He had spent years hunting the Dominion's secrets, driven by a singular purpose. His search had led him to whispers of a weapon, a force so terrible that even the Vashar feared it. The Black Sun Core, a power that had been sealed away, locked behind vaults of quantum-shifting metal, cast into the void where no living being should ever find it. Caney had found it. He stood before the containment sphere, its surface a swirling void, darker than the space around it. It did not glow, did not pulse, did not radiate energy. It simply existed, an absence of light, of reality itself. The Vashar had hidden it because they knew what it could do, because they feared what it might become in the wrong hands. They were right to be afraid. Caney reached out, his fingers hovering just above the surface of the sphere. It called to him, not with words, not with sound, but with something deeper. A whisper in his mind. A promise of power beyond measure. For years, the Vashar had erased his people, his home, his entire history. Now, he would return the favor. A tremor ran through the station as containment systems failed. The Black Sun Core was awakening, and soon the Vashar Dominion would burn. The Vashar Council convened in the Great Spire, their crystalline bodies shimmering with shifting colors as their voices layered upon one another in cold deliberation. Reports of the disturbance had reached them, but even among their kind, there was hesitation. "The core is moving," one of them intoned. "This should not be possible. The vault was impenetrable, the seals unbreakable," another voice colder than the void itself. "Then explain how a human is wielding it." The answer came not from words, but from the silent scream of a dying fleet. Across the galactic expanse, a Vashar armada was collapsing upon itself, its ships drawn into a singularity that had not existed moments before. It was not a battle. It was erasure. The Black Sun Core had been unsealed, and Elias Caney had declared war. The soundless void of space was shattered by the sudden flash of hyperspace. Entry, a rippling tear in the fabric of reality. It was an assault, silent yet devastating in its intent. Across the galaxy, the first response to Commander Elias Caney's declaration of war began. On the edge of the Vashar Dominion, a fleet of human warships emerged from the fabric of space. Itself, born of Caney's ingenuity and the desperate determination to break the chains that bound his people. The ships were cobbled together from wreckage, technology scavenged from enemy forces and remade into a weaponized reflection of human resourcefulness. The crews aboard them, remnants of scattered human colonies, had been hardened by years of war and loss. They were not afraid. The Vashar, on the other hand, had never anticipated such an attack. Aboard the flagship of the Vashar's outer defense fleet, Commander Zelthar of the Imperial Guard stood motionless, his many-eyed gaze sweeping over the latest intelligence report. He had been one of the Vashar High Command's most decorated tacticians, renowned for his ability to crush even the most formidable of enemies with efficiency and ruthless precision. Yet this human, was something different. Caney's forces were not supposed to exist, not like this. The Vashar had long since calculated humanity's projected lifespan in galactic terms. The human race, they had concluded, would either stagnate or self-destruct. Yet in the ruins of what had once been a bastion of peace, there was an anomaly. A single human had managed to bypass the Dominion's finest defenses and was now wielding the power of the Black Sun Core. Report. Zelthar's voice cut through the chamber, vibrating with a cold authority. A Vashar subordinate, visibly shaken, stepped forward. Commander, they've activated the core. It's unlike anything we've ever encountered. Their ships, they're bending space itself. Zelthar's many eyes narrowed, the black sclera reflecting the sheer magnitude of the energy readings. How long until they reach our fleet? 2 minutes, Commander, came the answer. The words barely registered before the entire station trembled, followed by an unearthly hum, a sound that felt like it was emanating from the deepest corners of the universe. It wasn't just a weapon. It was an extinction event. Elias Caney stood on the bridge of his modified ship, feeling a tremor in the air. The Black Sun Core had been activated, and the power at his fingertips was unlike anything humanity had ever imagined. Even with all his years of training, all the revenge he had stewed in his heart, he had never expected this overwhelming sense of control, of raw, destructive force. The stars themselves seemed to bow in submission as the Black Sun Core pulsed with unfathomable energy. It was alive, or something close to it. Caney had studied the Vashar records, understood what they had feared about it, and now he wielded it. The weight of that realization almost crushed him under its intensity. "Are you sure about this, Commander?" came the voice of Lieutenant Marcos Dren, his second in command. There was a note of uncertainty in his voice, one that hadn't been there before. "I'm sure," Caney replied, though his voice was colder than the void outside. "The Vashar will understand the cost of their arrogance. We won't stop until they pay for every single life they took." The ship lurched, and for a moment, Caney lost himself in the deep hum of the core's power. But then, as if in answer to a question he hadn't asked, the screen in front of him flickered. The Vashar fleet was arriving, too late to stop him. "Target their flagship," Caney ordered. A slight pause. Dren hesitated, glancing at the screen. "Commander, if we destroy their fleet, they'll send the rest. This won't end until—" "It ends now," Caney interrupted, his voice devoid of hesitation. Fire. The ship's cannons ignited, unleashing a focused blast of energy that would have obliterated entire worlds. But Caney wasn't trying to destroy the fleet outright. He wanted to send a message. The blast struck the center of the Vashar flagship and ripped through the hull as if it were made of paper. The sheer intensity of the impact caused the ship to collapse in on itself, the debris sucked into a black hole of its own making. For a moment there was silence. Then the rest of the fleet scattered, sending frantic, encrypted communications in all directions, though their fear was palpable. The humans had somehow not only breached their defenses but destroyed their pride, their symbol of dominance. Back at the heart of the Dominion, the Vashar High Council convened once more. The report of their fleet's destruction had sent ripples of terror through their ranks. Archlord Zelthar, a being whose very presence could command the galaxy's attention, stood alone in a room now devoid of any comfort. His long, multi-segmented limbs trembled slightly, but his eyes remained fixed on the holographic projections of the fleet's demise. How is it possible? The voice of his subordinate quivered. How could they? How could a single human? Zelthar's voice was like ice. The core, it is still active. This is no longer just a human revolt. It's a threat to everything we've built, a power beyond what we have ever faced. He turned, his gaze fixing on the massive, swirling storm at the center of the room, an image of the Black Sun core. We will not allow this human to destroy all we've built. We will find him, and we will crush him. A pulse of energy surged around them, the very fabric of space trembling under the weight of what was coming. Back on Kane's ship, the crew stood in awe, each one silently processing what had just happened. They had known the destruction was inevitable, but the scale of the Vashar's defeat stunned even the battle-hardened veterans. Kane stood at the helm, looking out at the void, his thoughts as dark as the space before him. They thought they could destroy us, wipe us out as they did so many others. He muttered to himself, his eyes cold with unspoken resolve. They thought we'd go quietly. His fist clenched. No, we're just getting started. The war had begun, and the galaxy would never be the same. The first victory had been intoxicating, but it was only the beginning. The sheer scale of the destruction Kane had unleashed rippled across the galaxy, sending shockwaves through the Vashar Dominion. Their once unquestioned might had been shattered in an instant, and now they were scrambling, their once sturdy ranks falling apart as they struggled to understand the nature of the weapon they were up against. As the human fleet ventured deeper into Vashar space, it quickly became clear that the Vashar were not going to simply lie down and accept their fate. What had seemed like an easy victory, a single blow that could end their reign, was quickly turning into something far more complicated. Kane stood at the helm of his flagship, staring out into the blackness of space. The stars were distant, cold and indifferent to the bloodshed taking place in their midst. It was a quiet, oppressive calm that weighed heavily on him, an ever-present reminder that while victory had come swiftly, it had not been without a price. The human fleet had pressed on, moving deeper into enemy territory, but Kane's heart was not light. His mind was consumed by the unsettling whisper of the Black Sun core, its presence growing more pronounced with every passing moment. He had come to rely on its power, but its influence was far from benign. The energy it pulsed with was not merely raw strength. It was something far darker. Kane's thoughts were interrupted by the voice of Dr. Serena Vallis, the ship's chief scientist. Her sharp intellect had been a driving force behind the initial discovery of the core, but recently, her concerns had grown. Kane could see the unease in her eyes, the tension in her voice whenever she spoke of the core's power. "Commander," she said, stepping forward with a reluctance that made Kane's stomach tighten. "We need to talk." He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "About what?" "The core. It's changing. It's feeding off more than just the energy of our weapons. It's feeding off the destruction. The more we use it, the stronger it becomes. And we're not the only ones feeling it. I've seen the crew. Some of them, they're beginning to change. They're becoming more cold, ruthless." Kane's brow furrowed. He had seen the shift in some of his soldiers too. Their morale had once been a tight-knit force, driven by shared loss and vengeance. Now a chilling detachment had crept into their actions. What had once been a focused rage had become something else, something far darker. "I don't care about their morale. The Vashar must fall," Kane said, his voice hard, his words cutting through the growing unease like a blade. "We're at war. They'll learn to live with it." "But it's more than that, Elias," Serena pressed. "This weapon, it's not just a tool. It's alive. or it's something that moves beyond what we understand. You've seen what it does to us. The more we rely on it, the more we lose ourselves. Caney didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted to the image of the Vasher fleet on the display screen. Their resistance was waning, but the war was far from over. The Dominion was vast, their military might unmatched. Even now, their reinforcements were on the move, and the Vashar High Command had begun to issue orders with more urgency. This was only the beginning of a much larger war, but was it the beginning of the end for humanity as well? The question of what Caney was becoming haunted him. But before he could wrestle with it further, the betrayal came. It was late in the cycle when Caney was awoken from a fitful sleep by the flashing red lights of the emergency alarm. His heart pounded in his chest as he threw on his uniform and hurried to the command deck. Dren, his most trusted lieutenant, was standing in front of the console, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" Caney demanded. "It's not us, Commander," Dren said, his voice strained. "Someone sabotaged the power systems. They've overridden the core's controls. We can't control it anymore." Caney's pulse quickened. He stormed toward the control panel, his fingers flying over the keys as he tried to regain control of the Black Sun core. But the system was already locked out. The energy readings spiked, too high for any human ship to withstand. The core was feeding off the destruction, yes, but now it was feeding off something else, something Caney couldn't control. "We need to disconnect it now," Dren shouted. "If we don't, the whole ship—" Caney didn't wait for the warning. He moved swiftly to the emergency override panel, but as his fingers reached for it, a voice called out behind him. "Don't do it, Elias." It was Serena. She had been silent during the whole exchange, but now she stepped forward, her face pale, her eyes haunted. "What are you talking about?" Caney turned, confused. "You've already crossed the line," Serena said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "The core, it's too powerful. It's too dangerous. If we continue down this path, we're going to lose everything. Our humanity, our lives, our souls." Caney stared at her, shock and anger fighting for dominance in his chest. He had known something was wrong. The whispers in his mind, the creeping darkness that was starting to cloud his thoughts, it was all because of the core. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't turn back. "Shut it down," Serena pleaded. "Please, before it's too late." But it already was. The Vashar, realizing the severity of the situation, had regrouped. They had mobilized what remained of their fleet and began to launch coordinated strikes against human positions. But they weren't the only ones who had changed. Caney, now fully aware of the price of his war, had become something else, something closer to the force he had once sought to destroy. He commanded his forces with an iron grip, his tactics growing increasingly brutal. The more the Vasher resisted, the more Caney relied on the power of the core. The more the core grew, the more it demanded. In a final, desperate move, the Vasher launched a counteroffensive, their last hope to push humanity back. But they had underestimated the ferocity of Caney's resolve. The battle was brutal, a clash of desperation on both sides, but it was the human fleet that held the upper hand. Each explosion in space, each ship that was torn apart, only seemed to make Caney stronger. But the price was becoming too high. The core pulsed like a living thing, its energy now bleeding into the human forces in ways they couldn't understand. Some soldiers had already fallen to its power, their eyes glazed over, lost in the madness of the energy they were channeling. They were no longer human. They were vessels for destruction. And Caney was no longer sure where the man ended, and the monster began. The stars above Vasher Prime were no longer the tranquil points of light they had once been. Now they were burning embers in the midst of an eternal storm, a storm born from the heart of the Black Sun core, which continued to consume everything it touched. The core, a weapon of unimaginable power, had become something more than a tool of war. It had become an entity, a presence that had grown beyond Kane's control. And now, it was pushing him toward the edge of something he couldn't come back from. "I've been analyzing the data," she said, voice shaking. The core, it's stabilizing, but it's not stopping, it's expanding. The more we use it, the larger the area of destruction. It's already altering the fabric of reality. If we don't cut it off now, the entire galaxy could collapse in on itself. It's consuming everything, Elias, us included. Caney felt a cold rush of fear run through him at her words. He had known deep down that this moment was coming. He had seen the signs, the dead eyes of his crew, the way they fought with unrestrained brutality, as if something had snapped inside them. He had pushed them to this point, and now it seemed there was no turning back. "What are you suggesting, Serena?" he asked, his voice colder than he intended. "Shut it down," she said firmly, stepping toward him. "The Vashar are already beaten. We've won. But if you let this go on any longer, there won't be anything left to save. Not for us. Not for anyone." Ain stood at the helm of his ship, staring out into the black void. His mind was a swirl of conflicting emotions. He had done what he set out to do. He had struck back at the Vashar, avenged his people, and broken their stranglehold on the galaxy. But in doing so, he had lost so much, more than he had ever anticipated. The whispers of the core had grown louder over the last few days. It was no longer a quiet hum at the back of his mind. It was a constant presence, its cold voice urging him forward, telling him that destruction was the only path, the only way to truly win, the only way to bring about the end of the Dominion. But something inside him recoiled. A part of him still remembered who he was, a human, a man who had fought for survival and justice, not for mindless annihilation. "Commander," said a voice, pulling him from his reverie. It was Serena, standing at the entrance of the bridge. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Caney stood still for a moment, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. He had once trusted her. He had once seen her as a partner in this fight. But now, as he looked into her eyes, he saw the truth in her words. He had lost sight of everything he had been fighting for. He had wanted revenge, justice, and the restoration of humanity's honor. But now, he was on the verge of becoming the very thing he had sought to destroy. But cutting off the core now, it was not as simple as turning off a switch. The core had already taken root. It was part of him, part of the fleet. To sever the connection would be to destroy everything, to cut the lifeblood from the fleet and from himself. The choice was no longer just about survival. It was about the very soul of humanity. Could he destroy the thing that had brought him this far? Could he let go of the one thing that had given him the power to reshape the galaxy? "You're asking me to destroy everything we've built," he said quietly, his voice hollow. "To erase the last chance we have to break the Vashar for good." "Yes," Serena replied. "It's the only way. If you don't, we'll become the very monsters we swore to fight against. The core is already changing us, Elias. It's not just a weapon, it's a temptation. And the longer we hold on to it, the less we are." The decision was made. The fleet would make its final push into the heart of the Vashar Dominion. But this time, it was different. Caney had decided that while the war could not be undone, he would stop the spiral into madness. The core would be shut down. The destruction would end. But as they approached Vashar Prime, something shifted. A sudden, overwhelming surge of energy flooded the ship's systems. It wasn't the core. It was something else. A counterattack from the Vashar. "I've been analyzing the data," she said, voice shaking. "The core, it's stabilizing, but it's not stopping. It's expanding. The more we use it, the larger the area of destruction. It's already altering the fabric of reality. If we don't cut it off now, the entire galaxy could collapse in on itself. It's consuming everything, Elias, us included." Caney felt a cold rush of fear run through him at her words. He had known deep down that this moment was coming. He had seen the signs, the dead eyes of his crew, the way they fought with unrestrained brutality, as if something had snapped inside them. He had pushed them to this point, and now it seemed there was no turning back. "What are you suggesting, Serena?" he asked, his voice colder than he intended. "Shut it down," she said firmly, stepping toward him. "The Vashar are already beaten. We've won. But if you let this go on any longer, there won't be anything left to save. Not for us, not for anyone. Ain stood at the helm of his ship, staring out into the black void. His mind was a swirl of conflicting emotions. He had done what he set out to do. He had struck back at the Vasher, avenged his people, and broken their stranglehold on the galaxy. But in doing so, he had lost so much, more than he had ever anticipated. The whispers of the core had grown louder over the last few days. It was no longer a quiet hum at the back of his mind. It was a constant presence, its cold voice urging him forward, telling him that destruction was the only path, the only way to truly win, the only way to bring about the end of the Dominion. But something inside him recoiled. A part of him still remembered who he was, a human, a man who had fought for survival and justice, not for mindless annihilation. "Commander," said a voice, pulling him from his reverie. It was Serena, standing at the entrance of the bridge. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear. Caney stood still for a moment, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. He had once trusted her. He had once seen her as a partner in this fight. But now, as he looked into her eyes, he saw the truth in her words. He had lost sight of everything he had been fighting for. He had wanted revenge, justice, and the restoration of humanity's honor. But now he was on the verge of becoming the very thing he had sought to destroy. But cutting off the core now, it was not as simple as turning off a switch. The core had already taken root. It was part of him, part of the fleet. To sever the connection would be to destroy everything, to cut the lifeblood from the fleet and from himself. The choice was no longer just about survival. It was about the very soul of humanity. Could he destroy the thing that had brought him this far? Could he let go of the one thing that had given him the power to reshape the galaxy? "You're asking me to destroy everything we've built," he said quietly, his voice hollow. "To erase the last chance we have to break the Vashar for good." "Yes," Serena replied. "It's the only way. If you don't, we'll become the very monsters we swore to fight against. The core is already changing us, Elias. It's not just a weapon, it's a temptation, and the longer we hold on to it, the less we are." The decision was made. The fleet would make its final push into the heart of the Vashar Dominion. But this time it was different. Caney had decided that, while the war could not be undone, he would stop the spiral into madness. The core would be shut down. The destruction would end. But as they approached Vashar Prime, something shifted. A sudden, overwhelming surge of energy flooded the ship's systems. It wasn't the core. It was something else. A counterattack from the Vashar. One final desperate effort to reclaim control, the Vashar launched everything they had left. The battle was fierce. Blinding explosions, pulse weapons clashing with gravity-defying shields, and the guttural roar of massive warships shattering as they collided with one another. Kane's crew, their minds still clouded by the core's influence, fought without hesitation. They were no longer the same men and women they had been. The war had reshaped them, transformed them into something other than human. Their hearts beat with the energy of the black sun, their blood infused with its hunger. Caney stood at the center of the chaos, commanding his fleet with ruthless precision. But the moment was slipping away from him. The further they pushed into the Dominion's defenses, the stronger the core became. The black hole of power at its center was growing, threatening to tear apart everything. And then, amidst the battle, the unimaginable happened. Caney felt the shift before it happened, an abrupt, crushing force that spread throughout his mind and body. His grip on the controls of the ship slipped and he stumbled forward, gasping for breath. His hands were shaking, his body convulsing with the energy that surged through him. The core, it was no longer just a weapon. It had merged with him. "Commander, Dren's voice faltered as he looked at Caney, his face filled with terror. "Elias, it's too much." Serena rushed to his side, but it was too late. The core was no longer something he could control. It was now part of him. Its whispers filled his ears, urging him to continue, to finish what he had started. But Caney could feel something deep inside himself, the remnants of humanity. the voice that had cried out for justice, for vengeance. He could feel it slipping away, drowning beneath the tide of power. "I won't become this," Caney whispered to himself. With every ounce of his will, he fought the core's influence, struggling to sever the connection. It was the hardest thing he had ever done. His body felt as though it were being torn apart, but he did it. He broke free, and in that final act of defiance, he did the unthinkable. He shut down the core, not just from his ship, but from every human fleet, every human soldier, every person who had been tainted by its influence. The darkness receded, leaving only silence in its wake. Caney collapsed to the floor, his body drained, his mind a haze of exhaustion. The battle was over, but the cost was staggering. He had won, but in doing so, he had become something else, entirely. Humanity's future was no longer certain, but the cycle of destruction had ended. The Vasher High Command, witnessing the sudden collapse of the human offensive, realized what had happened. Caney had taken their greatest weapon, the Black Sun Core, and turned it against them, using its power not to destroy, but to free his people from its influence. Caney, battered and broken, stood as the last human hope, a symbol of the resilience that had brought humanity to this point. But as he looked out at the stars, he couldn't shake the feeling that the cost of this victory was greater than anything he had ever imagined. The galaxy had been saved. But at what price? The silence that followed the collapse of the Black Sun Core was as deep and unyielding as the void of space itself. No cheering, no celebration, no fanfare. There was nothing left but the aftermath, the wreckage of a war that had nearly consumed everything. The human fleet, though victorious, drifted like ghosts among the stars. Their ships, once instruments of vengeance, now felt like tombs, silent and hollow, carrying with them the scars of the path they had walked. Caney sat in his quarters, staring at the cold, metallic walls. His body was broken, his mind exhausted, but his eyes still burned with a haunted fire. He had done it. He had destroyed the Black Sun Core, broken free from its influence, and in the process, he had saved humanity. But it didn't feel like victory. It felt like a long, drawn-out surrender to something far larger than any one person, far larger than even the Vasher themselves. The door to his quarters slid open, and Dr. Serena Vallis stepped inside. She was as weary as he was, her face pale, her eyes bloodshot from the long hours of constant monitoring and analysis. But there was something different about her, something that told Caney she had been changed too. The core had left its mark on her, just as it had left its mark on all of them. "You did it," Serena said softly, her voice almost a whisper. Caney's lips twisted into a faint, bitter smile. "Did I? Or did I just delay the inevitable?" She stepped forward, sitting down across from him. Her gaze was steady, unwavering. "You saved us, Elias. The core was a threat to everyone, including us. No one else could have stopped it. No one else could have made the choice you did." Caney looked away, his eyes narrowing. "I made a choice, yes, but at what cost? The crew, my crew, they're not the same. We're not the same." Serena's gaze softened. "We never could have stayed the same after everything we've been through. But you gave us a chance to rebuild, to survive, and that's more than the Vasher would have ever given us." For a moment there was a long silence between them. Caney's thoughts churned, grappling with the weight of what had been lost. Humanity had survived, yes, but they were forever scarred, changed by the events that had unfolded. The Vashar had fled, their empire shattered by the sudden collapse of their power. What remained of their once mighty fleet had retreated into the depths of space, vanishing from sight like shadows at dawn. The Dominion, though not destroyed, had been irrevocably altered. The Vashar would never again rule with the same iron. Grip. They had seen the cost of underestimating humanity, and they would now be forced to rebuild from the ashes of their empire. Humanity, too, would rebuild. The United Human Colonies had called for a ceasefire, and for the first time in years, the surviving factions of humanity were united, but the cost had been high. The colonies, once diverse in their outlook and divided by political strife, were now facing an uncertain future. The technology they had stolen, the power they had unleashed, had left them vulnerable. No one was sure what to do with the remnants of the Black Sun Core, or with the fractured relationships that had been forged in the heat of war. Caney stood at the bridge of his ship, staring out at the horizon. The war was over, but the real challenge had only just begun. The galaxy had changed, and humanity had a choice to make. Would they continue down the path of destruction they had been on? Would they seek to reclaim their place in the universe, to build something new, or would they be consumed by the very power they had sought to control? "You're thinking too much," Serena said, her voice cutting through his thoughts. Caney turned to face her. She was standing beside him now, her gaze focused on the stars, beyond. "Maybe. But the choices we made will echo for generations. This wasn't just a war, Serena. It was a reckoning." "You did what was necessary," Serena replied. What the Vasher never understood was that humanity doesn't just survive, it adapts. We learn, we grow. And when we're faced with something impossible, we figure out how to beat it. But we can't do that by relying on the power we've just destroyed. We have to move forward. Caney nodded, though it was hard to shake the weight of the past. The battle had been won, but there would be no simple answers to the questions now looming over humanity's future. The core had been a part of them, a part of everything they had become. To let it go was a sacrifice, but it was also a chance at a new beginning. The days following the end of the war were filled with uncertainty. The Vasher had withdrawn, but their power had not been erased. Their fear of humanity was now a tangible thing, one that would likely shape the galaxy for years to come. But the real struggle lay within humanity itself. The core had not only changed the war, it had changed the very essence of those who had wielded it. The human survivors now had to confront what they had become, and more importantly, what they would choose to become in the aftermath. Caney had been hailed as a hero by many, but there were others who saw him differently. The violence, the destruction, the way they had relied on the very force that had nearly undone them, it was all too much. The remnants of humanity had seen their capacity for greatness, but they had also witnessed their capacity for madness. Serena, ever the pragmatist, had been the one to propose the first steps toward recovery. The technology from the Vasher fleets, the knowledge they had acquired from the Black Sun Core, it would be used to rebuild, to advance humanity's understanding of the universe. But it would be done carefully, with strict oversight. They had learned the dangers of unchecked power, and now they would move forward with the wisdom that came from knowing how close they had come to losing everything. Caney, for his part, knew that he could never be the same. He had seen what power could do. He had felt its seduction, its pull. But he had also seen what could happen when it was used recklessly. And in that moment, he had chosen to let it go. As the fleet prepared to leave the orbit of Vasher Prime, heading toward the remnants of their homeworlds, Caney looked out at the stars once more. They were still there, vast and unknowable, stretching out into the infinite. But for the first time in a long while, he felt something new, a sense of peace. Humanity had survived. They had fought. They had faced the darkness. And now, they would shape the future on their own terms. The stars were still there, untouched by the devastation that had unfolded in the galaxy's most recent chapter. To the untrained eye, the universe appeared unchanged, vast, silent, eternal. But beneath the surface, things were different. The balance had shifted. Humanity had survived, yes, but at a cost. In the weeks following the collapse of the Black Sun Core, the remnants of the human fleet gathered at the edge of Vasher space. The survivors, once driven by vengeance, now found themselves facing an uncertain future. There was no unified plan, no clear path forward, only the knowledge that they had been given another chance, a second chance. Caney stood alone on the observation deck of his flagship, staring out at the distant stars. His reflection was faint in the glass, a ghost of the man he had once been. The battle was over, but the war within him still raged. "You look like you're 1,000 miles away," came a familiar voice. Serena joined him, standing beside him at the window. She had seen him through his darkest moments, had been there, when he had nearly lost himself to the power of the core. But now there was something different in her eyes. They both knew that what had been done could never be undone, but they also knew that it had been necessary. "I was thinking about everything we've lost," Caney said softly, his voice rough from exhaustion, "and everything we still have left." Serena didn't respond immediately. She knew what he meant. They had seen the price of power, of unchecked ambition. The destruction they had wrought was undeniable. But in the end, they had saved themselves from becoming something worse. "I know," she said quietly. "But we still have each other. We still have a future to fight for, and we can choose what that future looks like. We can choose to rebuild." Caney turned to face her, his expression unreadable. For the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to believe her words. Perhaps, for all their mistakes, humanity had earned the right to start anew. The war had ended, but the consequences were still rippling through the fabric of the universe. The Vasher had been humbled, but they were not broken. The galaxy was vast, and it was only a matter of time before another conflict would arise, perhaps not with the Vashar, but with something else, something darker, more insidious, more dangerous. And somewhere, deep within the core of a shattered star, a faint pulse of energy stirred. The human fleet began its journey home. The remaining colonies, those few that had survived the Vashar purges, began to rebuild. The technology that had been liberated from the Vasher and the remnants of the Black Sun Core was carefully analyzed, its potential for good tempered by the lessons learned in the fires of war. But as humanity began to heal, they were not blind to the possibility of new challenges. The galaxy was still full of unknowns, full of mysteries waiting to be unraveled. The darkness that had almost consumed them was never truly gone. It had only receded, waiting, lurking at the edges of their understanding. Caney had saved humanity, but he knew the fight would never truly end. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Humanity was no longer a fragile species at the mercy of others. They had stood against the unimaginable and survived, and now they would define their destiny. "Will we ever be able to outrun what we've done?" Caney asked, his voice distant again. Serena smiled faintly. "Maybe. But for now, Elias, maybe we can just move forward." As the human fleet moved toward the horizon of an unknown future, the stars before them seemed less distant, less impersonal. The galaxy was no longer a place where the strong ruled unchallenged, where the weak were crushed without remorse. It was a place where anything was possible. The echoes of their past would forever shape them, but the path forward was theirs to choose. And somewhere, in the distance, the faint pulse of the Black Sun Core continued to beat.